Well, once again, hello and welcome to our wonderful post-concert Q&A with the artists that were, well, some of the artists that were involved in the creation of this unbelievable set of pieces, and I'm so happy to be able to welcome for the first time in Cabrillo David Murakami. Thank you for joining our virtual season with your beautiful artistry. Of course, Sean has been to Cabrillo already. I mean, in fact, we did Melt there, and I was so happy to be able to hear it again. I've conducted it since then as well, but to be able to hear it in the recording, it brings back so many memories of our extraordinary orchestra, and then to see them on screen and to see their faces, all of it put together by none other than our resident magician, Svet Stoyanov, who worked an unbelievable amount of hours. I can't even begin to imagine. To create this extraordinary ensemble of musicians, but you really were the, should I say, the force that brought everything together, because it is recorded remotely. But if I during David's presentation, when we don't see the musicians, I really don't get a sense that the musicians were recorded, everyone with their individual microphones, everyone in a different space. None of that was controlled. I mean, there was some controlling, but it was that was the reality, Svet, right? Like everyone sent in what they could do on their device, right?
Exactly. And everyone did their truly best, though that is still coming in sounding slightly different because everyone's, if you will, living room or space, wherever they could record, has its own sonic properties. And so part of the process is really to try to blend as much as possible these instruments into real sounding sections. And so I actually use what we know as musicians, literally listening to the color of the instruments, listening to the articulation, and to many different aspects of the sound, just to try to basically then create those particular blends and morph them into orchestral sounds. So it's actually a very connected entity with what you do technically is very influenced by what you do musically, what you know musically. And in fact, I find myself to be really lucky to have those two hats that I could put on in different scenarios. It helps a lot.
So does this feel now like the next step for you is to become a conductor? Is that where this is going?
I do not dare. In fact, when I was a kid, we all, maybe me and you guys all felt the same and had the same experience. We had to do one semester of conducting in the conservatory. And I remember going on stage, it was, I think, Mozart 41, and I started shaking. I was so confident until the moment I got on stage. And I remember that very moment I set foot on the podium and I completely forgot everything I had studied. That is honestly where I first gained tremendously deeper and better understanding of how much pressure and how much knowledge it takes to even dare step on a podium.
Well, on the flip side, I can tell you that I had to take a semester of percussion when I was in college, and having those sticks in my hand. On my exams, I had to play the from Enigma variations. I had to play the tigadim pam tigadim tim tigadim in the timpani. That excerpt, and I felt exactly like what you're describing, confident until I sat down behind the timpani, and all of a sudden, like I was just hitting things, there was no music to be made. But anyway, Svet, I know what a tremendous amount of work and a splendid job you've done, because I think the world has now grown accustomed to these kind of videos. But I think the bar that you set with what you've created overall in this virtual season is really unmatched out there. So thank you so much for taking the time and the effort to really go after that perfection, really. So one thing that I want to let everyone know, if you have a question directly for Svet, for Sean, or for David, please make sure that you ask us the question, and then we will do our best to answer them. If not, I'm going to answer all the questions that I want to know about. Sean, I'm curious. You were saying that you purposely wanted to wait until tonight to listen to the pieces and to see the art associated with it. Tell me how you started telling me a little bit before we went live how it felt. Tell us.
Well, first of all, I just have to say, working both with Camille on the process that we had with Melt, which already existed, right? There was the recording that she had heard, and there was a sense of the story and a visual image and the world that she knew. And so we had a kind of conversation about, well, what could we make together that we have already sort of, how would I use a cooking analogy? It's, how do you mix a pound cake with a fresh salmon and make it sound something like, or taste something like you'd want. And not that those things were really, not that her work and my work are not very much in alignment, but that there were really so many things. I mean, just in the visual language of what she does that's so spectacular on its own. And so that conversation started really, from a very specific place. And I think with David, our first conversation was, well, it really had a lot to do with babies, because he had a very young baby and I had a slightly less young baby.
He gave me some phenomenal parenting advice. Phenomenal parenting advice. Thank you.
Oh, I really don't remember. So, but so most of it just was around the schedule when it could possibly work for both of us. And then I think we were interrupted by a waking baby. But that was such an earlier stage of the process for me. And I thought, well, I think this piece might be about this. I didn't have anything like a title. I didn't have anything like I had a sense of the message, or the feeling that I had when I said to the Cabrillo Festival, I really want to make this piece because I had this just horrible, just sinking feeling last August from watching from afar. And coming as I do from a place that is covered in forests, and having that, even quite recently with the Tamarack fires and the Dixie fires in Northern California, this sense of, my parents were prepared to pack up and leave, and they were very close to the message. I had the sense of that just utter sense of the whole sky dropping upon you, or the bottom falling out of you, or whatever the worst feeling is of everything sort of being sucked away. And so we sort of just started from this idea of what could I make that might be some kind of a response to that. And I went back and looked at those when I was in Santa Cruz for the premiere of Melt. I drove up and I went to the Henry Cowell State Forest. And I looked at those photos I took, and I just couldn't believe. I just still can't believe how amazing those creatures are. I'm a huge fan of the redwoods and the sequoias, and I like trees in general, but there was just something about it. I thought, no, it has to be some kind of celebration, and thinking about how these ecosystems actually function also as organisms, that there is a life cycle. There is something about it. In all the horror and destructivity that people and that we experienced, and that the people of Santa Cruz County really, really, really suffered and experienced, I also am just so struck by this sort of natural phenomenon that it requires a fire for these huge trees, for the redwoods and the sequoias especially. They need the heat to have this what's called basal sprouting, and you have these baby redwoods which sprout up to about 13 feet in the first year after the forest fire. And so the idea was, that what happens just after is actually so incredible, because it's in the process of a life cycle of a forest. It's like a millisecond and you have new forest growing. And so in all the as I say, the horror and the just the pain that I think a lot of people and I know a lot of people have lived through it all over Northern California. Not just, it's just been such a horrible 5 years for the last, for forest fires. And so that was our conversation with David. It was just this, where do we go from here? And then I really put it in his hands. And so the idea of getting to just see it all come together, very much in the same way I experienced it with Svet. He's just sent the first edit. And, normally I go through a rehearsals process, thinking, well, hope this comes together. And, with Svet, it was together, and it was so amazing. I was really not sure what I was going to hear. Obviously, when you write an orchestra piece, for whether it be for visual or for, the live concert stage, there's just so much you're not sure how it's going to work. And to hear it, it was about, like something like midnight when I finally was able to sort of sit down and listen to it. And I just stunned awake. It was so amazing to hear it that way. So I don't know. I'm not totally sure I'm done with the concert stage, but I could handle a few more visual premieres. They seem to work pretty well.
Well, that's I'm so Svet, I hope you take that as a compliment, because this is I think at this level, yes, I agree as well. I think I was thinking how hard we have to work the next time that I'm on the live stage, Svet, just to match the quality of what you've created. David, there's a question that has come in actually, and speaking directly to what Sean was talking about, and the question is, it comes from Cheryl Spencer. It says, I note the sprouting tree in Sprout in the piece. Was that animation or really time-lapsed film?
A combination of a lot of different things. So at the first sort of inspirational build to the music that I identified, that is particularly animation. But most of the footage in that piece was filmed, which was then run through a neural network to create that sort of illustrated feel, to sort of give everything the same aesthetic lens. So it was a combination of different media that I sort of all pulled together and tried to treat in the same way to give it all the same aesthetic gesture. Just because we were dealing with so many different types of images, from individual seedlings being sprouted to grand forest vistas to fire. And so I wanted to be able to pull from all those different kinds of areas, but then I'll sort of make it feel like it was really part of the same brushstroke, if you will. Yeah.
Phenomenal. So where did you, if I can ask, what did you shoot? And to then manipulate through the filters?
There were a few that were pulled from photographers, friends of mine, who were able to share their footage. A lot of it, though, was gathered via the internet and pulled from various places. There was an ongoing question about specificity, and that was a big challenge that we had. I spent a lot of time looking at the lightning complex fire, the specific images that came from that, the specificity of the tragedies that inspired the piece. And it was definitely a balancing act, because we wanted it. I wanted it, and I appreciate Sean's trust in me to just sort of, go wild, which was so fun to do. Usually I don't have so much freedom. But there was a challenge to how specific, how legible did we want this to be about a specific fire, a specific sprouting, or just the concept in general. And so we tried to strike a middle ground of California. There was a conversation on choosing California, I can't speak now, California fauna and flora, California flora that was appropriate, but not so specific to any one individual event. So it was a combination of pulling upon photographers that I know, but also just the internet and what was available to me.
As a performer and as a conductor, I know that one of the most challenging things, actually, when you try to have this marriage between sound and picture, is lining up events, and this is it's impossible, because there's always a little bit of, a second too much here or a second too little there. And I've done quite a few of these things where you have to line up. In fact, at the last live Cabrillo festival, we had a piece by Tan Dun that was this beautiful beautiful composition for microfilms and orchestra, that we had to line up someone singing on the film, and the orchestra was accompanying them live. And it made me think, seeing so many of the moments where you line up the event that is happening, like with the lightning, and you line it up so perfectly with music. I'm just curious, actually, because I think it's so beautiful the way that it comes through. But are you envisioning? This is both for Sean and for David. Are you envisioning the possibility of this happening in a live version of the piece? Like Sean, how would you feel about this piece? And you can put it out there and say, hey, you know what, we can do it. You can do it just as a symphonic piece, or if you would like to add another element to the piece, like I would recommend David's beautiful work.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm exactly with you on the lightning strikes. That was the exact thing that needed to happen. And I am just such a composer and musician. It never occurred to me to have something as well. What starts a fire? A lightning strike. But I was just thinking very musically in that sort of, I needed to snap out of the last musical material, and we need to have these jolts. And I was thinking, I'm thinking like, I need xylophones and violins, and so this idea, and this is what's so exciting from my perspective, is like, wow, yeah, there is a visual element to this for someone like David, who is just looking and thinking very rationally, visually. And so, I mean, it's like, as I say, it was telling a story I was trying to sort of hint at, and it's amazing. I mean, I can't recommend this experience highly enough. That everyone should write, a lot of music and then have other people animate it. It's really quite the Fantasia effect. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah. Well, I think for musicians, it works so well when you try to visualize what the music that you're making. And Svet, I think as a performer yourself, I'm wondering, because I find myself talking to orchestra about imagery and trying to portray something that helps us define actually our vision or our understanding of the performance itself, the interpretation, right? And we use in our conversations as musicians, when we rehearse, we use so much images of whatever we feel tells the story of the music, right?
Absolutely. And I feel like this is also where the beauty comes to how one interprets what they're communicated, and how do they use their imagination and their creativity to then translate that into sound or into art of any kind. And I think this is what makes every musician so unique, and every performance so special. But I have to say, in a ways, the very aspect of how much symbolism they can be in music, because we can describe something with a word that different people could understand completely independently and very diversely from one another. That itself is some of the most beautiful, I guess, part of the experience of making music. Because sometimes, it can turn into a miscommunication, and in others, it can open tremendous door to a performance that you never want to forget. But I remember at first, trying going to school at the Yale University for my master's, and I was really fortunate to study with a lady who is named Joan Panetti, who used to study with Messiaen, and she taught what we know conventionally as music theory. However, she called it hearing, as if we hear things, and she insisted we call it hearing. And I remember walking in the first day of school, and first class, and she gave us this test, and part of the test was, for example, she would play us a symphony, and the question regarding that excerpt would be, how many trombones are playing? And I was stunned. I sat literally on my chair, just scratching my head, trying to even understand how to begin thinking about this. And that the general depth of listening, that general depth of caring about something, and then thinking about it and being creative with it, that is some of the most beautiful part of what we do. And to me, there is nothing more interesting also to hear how you feel, for example, as a conductor, when you come in and tell us, can we try this and let's explore this vision. There is something really enriching to that, and of course it makes such a huge difference to the performance and the piece we're playing.
Yeah, I agree. David, a question has come in for you, and someone is asking, Lisa is asking, can you say more about the neural net you process the images through?
Sure. So briefly, the type of neural network that we use was called a GAN, or a generative adversarial network. As an artist, I will not pretend that I fully understand the technology behind it. There was a lot of back and forth and talking with people who are much more savvy than I. But essentially, the technology that we decided to use was to transform the images that we gathered, the video that we gathered, into as if it were painted by, say, an oil painter, an artist. And the effect was, I think, rather successful. For those of you who are familiar with CAPTCHAs on the internet, you go around the internet, occasionally there's a CAPTCHA that says, "Are you human?" Right? And about 5 years ago, or maybe about 5 years ago, they all started becoming like stop signs and traffic lights. I'm not sure if anyone recognizes that or realizes that. And the reason why is because of self-driving cars. That to train the neural network to figure out what is a traffic light, what is a stop sign, they started asking millions of humans all around the world to identify them. A similar thing happens here, where basically there is a group of people who feed Monet, Van Gogh, and train up these computer programs to try and understand what is it to look like being painted by a human. And the result is ever improving. I mean, the technology is not foolproof yet, but it's getting more and more realistic, more and more overcoming that uncanny valley between what is mechanical and what is human. But in essence, that's what it was. It was a neural network that was used to take the real images or animated images and turn them into this painted aesthetic. And it's invisible, but neural networks are all around us. I mean, right now, for example, my air conditioner right here is super loud, but you don't hear it because the microphone is using a neural network to take out the sound. And whenever UPS delivers their packages, they use neural networks to figure out what their best route is. And so it's definitely a passion and an interest of mine to see where technology can take art, not just, it used to be STEM. You learn about STEM in college, science, technology, something else in mathematics, engineering and mathematics. And now it's STEAM, where art is now part of that equation, which is very exciting. And that's sort of the norm now in university. So I'm very interested to see where these technologies will take us and the challenges that they'll introduce, because it's not all optimistic, because you've got things, for example, if anyone follow in the news, things about deep fakes, where neural networks are now used to swap people's faces to a degree of almost imperceptibility, which is horrifying and challenging in terms of how we address that in terms of our political place. So it's all very interesting, and I'm very interested to see how these technologies take us into the next generation of artists, but also wary, and it's complicated but exciting is my short answer.
Amazing. I had no idea about those things. So a couple more questions have come in for Sean. Actually, the first one from Marcello, he asks, Sean, did you consider using non-traditional or non-Western instruments in either of these pieces? Is the first question, and then I'll ask you the second one after you answer.
Oh, that's a good question. I think I always like to try to consider it. I don't know how to put it any other way other than, first of all, I think writing for instruments is it's like a lifelong process. To write really, really well for the violin, you really have to understand how that thing works. And that's one of maybe 100,000 instruments that exist in the world. And so the idea that there are composers and there are people who are really dedicating an enormous amount of time and energy to bringing, let's say, it's an unfortunate word, the word is new instruments to the orchestra. I mean, whether it was something like the saxophone or something like any number of percussion instruments, or something like, the Korean composer Eun Suk Chin has brought a lot of traditional Asian instruments into, in a few instances, to solo roles with the traditional standard symphony orchestra. It's one of those things. It's just a really serious undertaking, and I think it's one of those things with a lot of things in novel ways of using the orchestra. I like to think of all kinds of novel ways of using the orchestra, or I like to know about it, because then I think it has to sort of float in and think, no, that's the thing I need. And so in the event that I will ever require, even something as relatively tame as a, cimbalum or something, I think it would be just something I would have to kind of, it's almost like a backward process. I'd really have to understand what I was doing there, because I think I'm so, I don't know if the word is conservative, but I long ago just chose that either I was going to be able to write for the harp or the guitar, and I couldn't do both. They're very, very, just very special instruments, but they have so many idiosyncrasies. And at some point, I just chose the harp, and I have now written a relatively significant amount of music for harp. And I just thought, maybe in my later decades, I'll just tackle the guitar with abandon. But as I say, they just even read this staff or the staves so differently than the instruments. The harp, they have 8 fingers, not 10, and that's just it's such a basic thing, but it makes all the difference. And so, it's a great question. I always think, if there's a way I try to think about things in a novel way, a little bit like maybe the very end of Melt with that eerie percussion thing. I was working a little bit with, we had some, every performance I think has had some slightly different, something that was slightly out of tune, and it sounds kind of wonderful in a different way. And so I think that there's just always something that it's maybe in a little slightly too subtle level, but I think I'm using instruments that we all kind of were relatively familiar with, but I want to try something my own way with it. And as a matter of fact, I'm just starting to hear this week a premiere of a brand new piece for a chamber group, and I'm using one of the instruments is instrumentalist is a percussionist, and the only thing he plays for a whole movement is with wooden chopsticks, and so he plays all kinds of different instruments. And for that, to me, that's exciting and interesting, and because it's kind of coming out slightly different than I thought it would. And I think it's maybe not the most groundbreaking idea, but I wanted something that was a very, just thinking about something that this very, very strong piece of wood that's very light. What can you do with it? And so I kind of come at it maybe from, I don't maybe go as far in experimentation, but I try to go at a sort of relatively deep level.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. I mean, after all, when you start to make the calculations of how many instruments are in an orchestra and how many notes each instrument can make, and then you're looking into quarter tones and you're looking into all kinds of, it really is an infinite number of possibilities of combinations of colors of things that you can do, and that's before you even tackle things like harmony and rhythm. Right, so it's really quite an infinite array of possibilities, which is why I think symphonic music still has a long way to go before people say, okay, everything has been done. So that
you could just never know too much. There's just it's not possible.
Exactly. And the second question that came in for you, it says, what are the different considerations between writing a longer piece or a shorter piece?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. It's actually very hard to be clear and clever and pithy and interesting and somewhat significant in the span of 4 or 5 minutes. It's actually really hard to get your point across that quickly. Was it Dorothy Parker? She did it pretty well in the columnist in the New Yorker. But we just don't all have these gifts. And so I'll go back to that lightning strike moment, because I was at a point with the early part of that piece, and I had very specific musical concerns. If you look at the early, I think it's almost like 26 bars of that piece, there is neither a sharp nor a flat. And I was really working in the white keys of the piano. And I wouldn't say it's A minor, and I wouldn't say it's C major, but it's somewhere in the middle. And I really focused on trying to find something new in my own language that was within a very limited realm. 7 notes instead of 12 is a very big difference. And so, but I really needed something to snap out of that, because I think I probably could have gone a lot further with that early music, but it needed, the story wasn't going to be served if I just sort of kept whipping up more drama with the orchestra. I needed to sort of cut it away. And so that was the sort of first of these moments of like, how do I make something that feels like it should be 5 minutes? How do you do that when you're writing something that feels like it should be 45 minutes? Those are really different equations. I also have a very sort of strongly held opinion that every added minute of music that you have made or asked people to listen to, it needs to be that much more worth it. It needs, this is why people flock to Mahler 3, because there is something really quite significant about the entire experience, the entirety of the experience. And so, but if you think of the opposite of that, so many great Russian overtures, John Adams' Short Ride in a Fast Machine, there's not a note too few or too many. It's perfect. And it's really, really hard to do that in 3.5 minutes. It's really hard. I keep trying. But I think there was also something about this message and something I want to do that I think I could have written a 20-minute piece. I think it would have been a very different piece. But I think approaching it just really, I haven't spoken with David or anybody else who works in film, but I mean, there's a difference between a short and a feature length, or a tentpole franchise when you have 3 more movies that you can actually sort all this stuff out. And that's all what's so fascinating and interesting about structure. But it's also, I think, so much we live in this really temporal world that nothing that we're hearing going forward is ever not influenced by what we've already heard. We can't actually forget what we've already heard. And so when you're writing it, you have to, I think any composer should or would try to keep that in mind. It's not something that's existing, I mean, I guess you could read, the pages of a book backward. But, in so many of these sort of worlds of art that we're working with, we're working forward either in time or space or some kind of place. And so the idea of whatever the scale of that is so vital to keep in mind. So it's not that I really prefer a 5-minute piece over a much longer piece. They're just really different problems. And I find it's a little bit like writing a piece for 2 people versus 200 people. They're just really different problems. That one isn't more satisfying or less than the other. They just are. And that's actually, what's so can be invigorating about different kinds of projects, that you really get your brain working on totally different problems.
I'm reminded of a story about a very, very famous composer attending another famous composer's opera premiere. And this second composer was very well known for writing unbelievably lengthy operas. And after the premiere, they were asked and said, Maestro, what did you think of the premiere of the new piece? And the first composer said, well, it was wonderful. I said, around midnight, I looked at my watch and it was 8:30. So
I'll jump in here and just respond to some things that Sean said. First, I work primarily in opera, and I have done my fair share of Philip Glass operas. So the observation that, you know, some pieces are meant to be long and some pieces are meant to be short resonates with me. And I totally understand. But I think to your point about film, I know if someone else other than myself had interpreted or taken their crack at animating or creating some kind of visual accompaniment to your piece, I'm sure it would be very different, because my background is from a film background. I mean, screenwriting is sort of the original way that I got into the entertainment industry. And one thing about screenwriting at Hollywood is how absolutely uncompromising story structure is. I mean, the 3-act structure of what is accepted in a Hollywood film is like a straitjacket, and you can do beautiful things in that straitjacket, but you know, there's 3 acts. Each, you know, act transition's got to do a certain number of things. It's called the Dark Night of the Soul. End of Act 2, when all hope seems lost, and that, you know, it's. And when I heard your piece, in the way that my brain works, oh, there's the 3-act structure: birth, conflict, rebirth. I mean, that's like, you know, the hero's journey. That's, you know, Campbell. You know, so yeah, I hear that. And the thing is that any good story, any good anything, I feel like, can be seen in that lens, regardless of length. And so whatever the length winds up being, you know, we see within the individual acts all the fractals and the depth, but for what you created, to my eye, felt like a story. And when I listened to it, it was almost immediate that I saw it in that lens, because for whatever length that it was, it told a story, and I was able to build off of that. So successful in that regard, I'd say.
Mm. Well, my own personal reaction to Sprout actually is that every time I listened to it, I always felt like it left me exactly at the point where I felt like I understood what you had to say, but at the same time, I would have been just fine listening to a little bit more. You know what I mean? Like, there's that sweet spot where you don't want a short piece to feel like it's too long. I think that's, in some ways, that's even worse than a long piece feeling like it's too long, you know, because at least you can justify the feeling, you know. So this was my own impression to this. Svet, let's. Sorry, Sean, do you want?
Oh, I was just going to say, I have to say, it happens in. I have several short pieces, and I actually just had a different one perform, a very old piece performed a few weeks ago, and it happens that people will come up to you, you know, after the concert and say, "Why was it so short?" So what I would say, well, that was actually what we planned to do, and I don't want to, like, I have long pieces. You could go, you know, we can sit and listen for 6 hours if you'd like, but it feels, you know, they're sort of annoyed at me, but I really do take it as a compliment. It feels good.
Good. Sean, as you were talking, there was one more question that came for you that says you were commissioned and you knew that this was a virtual orchestra that will do the premiere. And the question was, how did that change your composition? And I'm gonna, or did it change it? You know, because I remember when we talked to the orchestra, and I've mentioned this before, when we talked to the orchestra, letting them know what we will be recording and how this will work and all of this, the first question that came to me, or the first comment that came from someone in the orchestra, was, can you please tell the composers to try to not make the piece simple just because we have to record it remotely? You know, please try, in some ways, like, try not to dumb down the music just because it'll be easier for us to put it together. You know, which I thought was really a beautiful thing. You know, so I'll let you answer.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I really spent probably way too much time worrying about it. I really just imagined, you know, like Justin Bruns and Lauren and all these wonderful players, you know, sitting in their practice rooms thinking, how are they going to, you know, okay. And I understood that, and maybe Svet has already talked about this, but there is a very sophisticated way that people are able to know when to be playing what, and you know, that you have this amazing synchronicity and all that stuff, so that the material, once it comes in, is assembled, is in the right place and the right time and all But I really did spend a lot of time kind of agonizing, thinking, oh, I don't know if quintuplets are a good idea. I mean, I still wrote them, but I didn't know it would work as well as it did. And that, it's funny because I think it was also a good exercise for me. And I kind of needed something that was like a very different kind of box to be put in. I feel like, it's not, there is nothing bad about restrictions. I think it was Stravinsky who said, only within the strictest set of rules can we be set free creatively. And I think there is something about that you can, and oftentimes we have to do it ourselves. Composers have to build their little systems or whatever we want to call them to try to find something that isn't just sort of blowing itself out of proportion all the time, like 1,000 great ideas or 1,000 terrible ideas, whatever it is. But that I think the idea that that the players would never actually be together, never. They have not ever been in the same room now since 2019, very sadly. But that that we were planning this together, and that I do believe that if I hadn't considered it at all, I don't think I would have made something that would have worked very well, because it's hard for me to think about. It's just hard to imagine these things actually working when you have 100 people and they're not in the same place. How does that work? I mean, it's just crazy. So the fact that it did in its own way, and I just remember thinking that the first time I heard the early versions, I think, oh, okay, well, it actually, because it is one of these things of, there is a semblance of color and playing and style that maybe the notes themselves are suggesting. I'm not sure, but it sounded right, and we just never had that. You and I never had those conversations before rehearsals, and I wasn't sitting 20 feet behind you while you were talking about the orchestra. This is how this goes, and so. As I say, I needed this experience it felt invigorating, and actually, as I say, worrisome. I was worried about it, but it was what I needed to do.
I'm really curious to know how it will feel when you hear the piece for the first time live at the first rehearsal. Like how that will change your perspective on the piece. Because I think, your music in general is wonderfully challenging for the orchestra, and I mean that wonderfully challenging, because there is music that is difficult for no good reason, and then there's music that is difficult because it needs to be that, it's been 100+ years since the entire world has embraced but still struggle with performing Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, and without that push, I think that our world as performers and even composers, I think would be quite a step back, without Stravinsky saying, no, we are going to do that, and that's the instrument, and that's the rhythm I want for everyone to play, so that's what I mean. It's wonderfully challenging, but I'm curious how it will feel now that you had all those worries that perhaps you didn't have before at the same level, and now when you'll see, I just remember one of my favorite stories is John Corigliano coming to Cabrillo, and we were doing the piano concerto, which he had written 50 years earlier. It was his first symphonic piece, orchestral piece that he wrote, and we did the first rehearsal. It's an amazing piece, but very, very challenging. And we did the first rehearsal, and we finished, and I went back to sit next to him, and I said, John, tell me, how do you feel? And he said, I said, my God, he said, I wish I could write music like that. I said, I just don't have it in me anymore. I said, it's so difficult, and it was amazing to see the 50-year transformation of someone that, I think he literally was just all the considerations that build up with time, like, should I be writing this? Like, isn't this too difficult? Like, maybe I should be, like the life experiences of, being 30 versus being 80 and having been to 50 years of performances of your music, where you're just like, come on, like, I just need to write something simpler, at the end of the day.
Yeah, you begin to ask yourself, is it worth it? And that's where I don't know why I keep going back to the lightning strikes, but that was a moment that I thought, there, you know, if you look at the page in that gesture, there's a lot of very fast, very different little things happening, and it goes by in a split second. And that was one of these moments I thought, I'm not sure it's, you know, is it worth it? Is it worth it for the players? They're going to work really, really hard to get this blip, you know, that really tiny little thing. I mean, I think we can all agree that it was, and it was just amazing. Mostly thanks to David, but that, you know, that there's always this moment of when you know you're kind of approaching the edge of the cliff of, oh, this is going to be, I mean, once in a while it happens that I actually fall off the cliff and I had no idea that it was going to be a challenge. And then in that case, I really try to make revisions, because if something's just sort of awkward and awkwardly made for the orchestra, I really don't like that about the piece. And I think there's always ways that a composer can kind of rewrite it and make it more functional. But that, yeah, it's a really, yeah, it's the age old question. And I know that feeling that John was speaking of, well, let's just, you know what, let's just soften it. Let's just put these, you know, baked potatoes in the blender. We'll just have mashed potatoes. It's just a little easier. You know, dinner is going to be ready in 5 minutes.
Is that how you make mashed potatoes? Baked potatoes? I didn't know that.
I mean, I'm a very good cook, and I'm pretty sure that's how you do it. Yeah.
So, Svet, we have a question for you here that I think you and I have talked about this before, but let's I'll ask you again, because it says, did this whole project, you know, make you feel especially connected to your orchestra colleagues? Now you know the most intimate voices and tendencies and colors, you know, they create with their instruments. Would you mind sharing with us again about this?
Yes, I mean, of course, I find that, you know, in fact, if you think about it, I find it very privileged opportunity to be able to hear literally personal performances of every individual member of the orchestra for myself, of this beautiful music that Sean wrote, and also that Gabby wrote and Jake wrote. And in this particular case, I find it very intimate and very personal to be able to hear someone's singular part. I mean, technically, no one ever gets to do this from the audience perspective. This is a very much almost asking someone to tell you some of their most intimate and private thoughts. A musician practicing or performing something and recording it, it's a very intimate moment. This is basically a precious experience for us. And so I really did not take it for granted. In fact, I found it very illuminating to be able to learn from my colleagues and friends. And definitely, I find that the meaning of that and the experience of that bonds us, of course. And, you know, I also was in touch with them quite a bit throughout the process. Many people called or texted or wrote and had either questions or ideas. So also there was a lot of dialogue, which, you know, in a very minuscule way, it gave me that bit of feeling of what's it like to be in Cabrillo, you know, where the whole environment is just buzzing with energy and everybody is practicing in different areas and talking about the music and just really working on toward a common goal, which is what we did here. And it felt beautiful, you know, really did. I wanted to jump back, if you don't mind, on something you guys were talking about, which was taking risks. I remember also having a conversation actually with John Corigliano about his Symphony No. 1. And he shared an extremely similar sentiment where he just said, I don't know how I wrote this. Because actually I asked him, how is it possible for you to write such fearless music? What does it feel like when you're writing it? And I have to say, music is a very interesting domain because as people, I guess, as we spoke earlier, the older we get, the more we feel like we have something to lose, right? And so therefore we become slightly more cautious. But music doesn't allow that. At the end of the day, even though maybe we put slight filters to ourselves, so we have to be very fearless because otherwise, I think we might end up sort of having to have this haunt us. And I find it's a very interesting paradox where from one side, we have to, exactly as Sean said, be extremely wise and I don't know, find that very, very delicate line that is giving service and justice to everything we do. Yet at the same time, music is not something that allows people to be careful when it comes to giving everything and contributing fully and wholeheartedly. It's such an interesting domain to be in, where one can be adult yet has to be a kid.
Yeah, yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful the way you put it. Svet, just continue, because we haven't actually talked about this, but you know, the last or the second version of Sprout, where you actually show us the musicians that recorded the piece, and I think for some of our audience members, you'll be surprised to see some new faces as well, because this was something that we insisted on doing, and we said that we will not compromise at all in our artistic integrity in terms of the number of musicians in the orchestra. So if someone was not able to attend the virtual Cabrillo this year, let's put it this way, then just as we would in a live session, in a live version of it, we would ask for a substitute for the year. So just so that everyone has a context of this. And the question that comes in from Cheryl Spencer, it says, how do you choose whose image to show beyond, you know, that person or that instrument is playing? But in some cases, you know, when you have 15 or 20 violins, they're all playing the same line, and yet you have to choose one individual doing that. How do you choose? How did you choose those moments? And I thought it was really quite beautiful, I have to say. It gave me personally a different impression of the piece. You know, it was magical. I mean, really.
Well, I really appreciate you saying this. Actually, this question was one of the most difficult ones to answer, and I find that there's many more than one answers for this. I would imagine David feels the same way when you ask him, what would you like to choose? What would you choose to show next of all the footage you have, right? There's just so many wonderful, in my case, specifically, so many wonderful people who I want to show at the same time. Interestingly, because the screen is only this large, in fact, the more you show detail, the less one sees. And I find that the goal for us, we unified on that vision early on, was not really to try to entertain the eye, but really to connect with our listeners, with our audience, with our friends. And to do this, I thought it's important to pace everything carefully. And, you know, in a way, I tried to imagine what would it be like if someone experienced this piece from an audience perspective. What would they hear and what would they take a look at? Where would their attention be drawn to? Or sometimes, what should I try to draw our listeners' attention to, considering that they're not able to come to the concert hall exactly? So there were those two opposites that I had to consider. And at the end of the day, also, it was very interesting. You know, sometimes how you notice a person performing and they're just so absorbed by what they're doing and they're so connected with it that that particular moment, specifically of all moments, seems a little more magical. I would find these as well, because I find that it's very difficult to create something that through a screen a listener, an observer can connect to. And that's literally our goal here, is to take all the borders down. And we talked about it early on. We want to make no compromises because we love our audience. We love all the people who come and listen to the music we perform, and we miss them. And so it literally came of how much can I put myself in their shoes, or in their seats, shall I say, and at the same time give justice to Sean's piece. Literally, both of these were the most important.
That's such a beautiful way you're describing it, Svet. I think we all feel the same about the audience, about the experience of what Cabrillo means to us, to the musicians, to the performers, to the composers, if I can say so, Sean. The fact that you know, we feel so privileged to have the opportunity to be nurtured in such a positive environment that gives us the freedom to dream big and to do our art the best that we can. And of course, none of this would be possible without having an incredible supportive staff that ensures that this festival happens at the quality that we like to have it, and And so I want to take this moment, actually, because we're also coming up on the end of our discussion, to thank our staff that has shifted gears sometimes more than once to be able to accommodate this new medium, but at the same time created in such a meaningful way, without compromising the artistic quality, without losing the connection with our audience, and remaining the conduit that allows us to create the art that we believe in and we want us all to experience. So, I speak on behalf of the orchestra here when I say that we are deeply, deeply grateful for all the work that we've had behind the scenes, that we don't get to see, and I hope that everyone understands the unbelievable, enormous amount of work that went into preparing this, and sometimes 6-hour concert is just as difficult as a 4-minute overture, to riff back on what Sean was saying, in terms of the preparation behind the scenes, in order to maintain that quality and to have that energy that is necessary. For me personally, I couldn't be more proud to at least have my name associated with something so extraordinary in terms of the beautiful work artistically that was put into this, the creation of what we've done. I'm so proud that we're able to leave this legacy that will exist on our website. I know that Camille, unfortunately, was not able to join us for this discussion, Camille Seaman, because she lives in Ireland and it was very, very early or late, depending which way you're looking at it, in the night. But there is a fascinating discussion with her from earlier today, and I encourage everyone to go to our website and to listen to this interview. But please encourage your friends. We created all of this for you, for all our, actually for the entire world. And our goal in Cabrillo is to find an artistic way to spotlight something that is deeply meaningful to all of us. And this vision through the arts, through the power of the arts, to be able to make us think and to ask a question, but at the same time appreciate the beauty that art can bring in our lives. We strongly encourage you to share this with your friends as if this was the best kept secret, and then invite them to watch what we've done and to listen to what we have created together with our partners, our colleagues. So from me, I am extremely proud to be part of this team that has created these wonderful artistic moments that will live on forever. So thank you again. This is in some ways the end of our virtual season. I am both sad and happy at the same time because I can be so proud of what we have achieved. And we cannot wait. I cannot wait to see you next year in Santa Cruz. Thank you, everyone.